Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Cracks are beginning to appear in the Kurdish Regional Government in northern Iraq. The offices of all the major parties have been attacked in Sulaymanyeh province, and a number of people have been killed in a crackdown by security forces. Two opposition parties have quit the local government, and as anger grows over austerity measures, unpaid wages, and of course the fallout from September's independence referendum, Iraq's central government says it could step in. So to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Namo Abdullah. He's an Iraqi Kurdish journalist, and in London is the Kurdish writer and journalist Rebwa Fatah. Now, we also invited some representatives from the Kurdish Regional Government onto the programme, but unfortunately they were not available. First of all, Rebwa Fatah in London. We've seen the violence flaring in Sulaymanyeh province, and then we've had a reaction from the Iraqi central government, a brigadier general saying the Iraqi armed forces could intervene. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think so. I don't think intervening the Iraqi security forces is really a good option. I think Iraq can help in other ways to ease out the situation. Maybe by meeting the Kurdish Authority, maybe by promising to pay the salaries of the civil servants and others. But intervening, adding more fuel to the fire doesn't really help.
I mean, paying the salaries of the civil servants, isn't that the KRG's job?
I mean, that obviously it is disputed. I mean, apparently, I mean, according to agreements and constitution, 17% of the Iraqi, if you like, GDR should go to the KRG, and KRG arguing that they have not received that. Obviously, it's not that simple, because the federal government accusing Kurdish government that they sell oil, and the oil must go to the federal budget and so on. So it's rather, I think they are in a mess because they left it too late, and they didn't manage to solve the problems much earlier. Now we are really in a very bad situation.
I mean, Namo, not solving the problems early enough. You've had 10 years of this, oil revenue coming in. Why were the KRG not able to diversify and fund other projects so they weren't so reliant on oil and when in the mess they are in now?
Well, that's definitely what you're raising a very good point, diversifying the KRG's economy. These protests are happening at a time just shortly after the Kurdish people held an independence referendum, which miserably failed. And the Kurdish, it's clear that they were not ready for this referendum. And the Kurdish people, you know, they have almost no source of revenue. So the KRG leadership has almost utterly failed to, to diversify the economy. The agriculture sector has been ignored. Now the oil price has plummeted. The KRG has no money, basically, to fund. It is, huge public sector. And by the way, that might be news to some of our viewers that more than 60% of Iraqi Kurdistan's employees are public employees, are government employees, rather than private sector employees.
I mean, they've had all this time and all that money. You say it's maybe a failure of the political leadership, but we have had political parties who didn't want to push for this referendum now. There are a couple of parties who said we should wait a couple of years, perhaps, for the referendum to be held. Why was it so vehemently pushed forward now to abject failure?
Well, many people were surprised to what happened afterwards. And a lot of Kurds are now mad, not just at their own leadership, but also at the reaction to the referendum, especially from Baghdad. Baghdad has almost collectively punished the Kurdish people after this referendum, which has been cancelled, suspended at least. So the airports in the KRG are closed. My wife, who's here with me, she couldn't travel really unless she had to go to Baghdad, then come to Istanbul. A few months earlier, she could come directly from Sulaymanyeh to Istanbul, no problem. So the Kurdish people are suffering as a result of this referendum. But you're right, the KRG leadership wasn't ready for this referendum. They told us they were ready. They told the world they were ready. President Barzani himself told the former president, the whole world told the whole world that there would be a more positive reaction to this referendum, but the result was very much different.
Absolutely. Rebwa Fatah, these protests that have sparked in Sulaymanyeh province, there has been reporting that there's some outside influence involved. What credence do you give to those reports? And do you agree with Namo here that this is not just a question of the current leadership, the Barzani and the Talabani family in the KRG, but perhaps the entire political establishment that the Kurdish people are upset with?
I think the entire Kurdish political leadership is corrupt and they fail to provide services. It's not today's problem. It has been accumulating since 1991. I think the Kurdish people in Kurdistan region have been very tolerant, but it come to a point, I think enough is enough. And going back to the question about outside interference, I mean, there's always, when people are unhappy with the services, with the leadership, that's a Middle Eastern thing. It doesn't happen here in London when I'm talking to you. I mean, it's always outside because they don't want to blame themselves. I think that the body that is responsible for today's violence and killing over 90 people and arresting about 188 and I don't know how many people are wounded is really the Kurdistan Regional Government. It's their failure. It's their failure throughout years. And of course, Masoud Barzani should take the most responsibility because, of course, I understand this is people's unsatisfaction with jobs, with corruption, with the rest of the issues in the KRG. But what didn't really help Masoud Barzani's adventure, naive adventure with the referendum. And of course, people in Kurdistan today believe that, if you like, they are humiliated, not by Kurdish political forces, but by Iraq, by Turkey, by Iran, because they all together oppress Kurds after the referendum. I agree with my friend Namo in the studio. Abadi tried to play a tough man, punishing Kurds, like closing down the exits to the international community. That has nothing to do with the Barzani of Kurdish leadership. That's people like me and Namo suffering. We cannot go back to see our families. So I think, although it's total failure of the Kurdish administration, but the Iraqi Federal Authority must also take lion's share for that, because throughout there they couldn't diplomatically or politically solve their problem with the KRG. It came to a point that they have to use Shia militia groups to attack Kurds, and there's many people as a result of that attack killed, and that's not really helpful. So people's anger is not just against the Kurds, the Kurdish administration. It's against Abadi, against the regional powers that they all go together, punish Kurds for Barzani's adventure. I think the person should have been punished, should have been Barzani and his leadership, not the people.
Okay, Rebwa, let's go to Baghdad and bring in a guest that we have in the Iraqi capital, Ahmad Rushdie. He's a foreign policy advisor for the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. Ahmad Rushdie, you will have heard some of what Rebwa Fatah was saying there. Just how much blame do you think the Iraqi central government have to bear for what is currently happening in the KRG?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what is the definition of the crisis that between Baghdad and Erbil. It's a humanitarian, political, and economical. At the same time, there is already a humanitarian, political, and economical crisis inside KRG. So both sides, Baghdad and Erbil, needs to understand the situation well. At the same time, we must not forget that we have elections in 2018 that's supposed to be KRG or Kurdistan or the Kurdish people should participate in it, which means that all the crises that I mentioned before should be solved before the elections, or there will be a problem inside the national elections of Iraq, which is also give some sort of evidence that it cannot the national elections cannot be happening in April, because all these crises, all these level of crises, actually pushing Iraq toward not to be on a settlement near the elections. Now, according to what's happening between Baghdad and Erbil, it's supposed to be there is a door opened by the international community, is that the international community, like IMF, International Bank, and the UN, should help Iraq in the financial crisis. At the same time, should push the Iraqi government to settle its problem with Kurdistan by paying the 12% budget. But also, the Iraqi government said, what are the guarantees it will reach to the people? Because we all know that the corruption inside KRG is very high. So all these negotiations now are on the table, but it should be settled before the elections, or we're going to see something else.
Ahmed Rishi, I mean, that's all very well and good, expecting the World Bank to help out the international community, but the seizing of Kirkuk after the referendum, that was in no way helping the KRG. It was actually taking money away from that organisation. How do you answer that?
Well, for the referendum, if I understand the question well, Kurdistan said we are respecting the judgment, or let's say the decision of the Supreme Court, of the Federal Court in Baghdad. And the Iraqi government saying that it's supposed to be you are obeying the decision because you are inside Iraq. It's not you are respecting the decision.
So although they're autonomous, they have to obey every decision made by central
on the table. It should be that the referendum should be settled in a way that the results should be freezed or should be denied or rejected in a way that at the end the settlement will happen between Baghdad and Erbil. Now, Mr. Abadi is looking for, as a political man, to put the crisis as it is, not changing anything, because it will help him inside the election itself in next April.
I mean, you're shaking your head there, Reba. Do you want to respond to what you heard coming from Baghdad?
I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't know how many. Obviously, my friend in Baghdad answered the question. Let me go on by. The Kurdish authorities is corrupt from top to bottom, but there are more corruption in the federal government. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there are figures, there are Transparency International puts like Iraq in, I don't know, right to the bottom. Okay, that's. And secondly, there was no reason whatsoever to attack Kurdistan by Shia militia groups, an unconstitutional group, and claiming that implementing constitution, okay? Let us put that, let's just kill that, okay? And obviously, the crisis today, the civil unrest in Kurdistan and bloods on Kurdish streets, Mr. Abadi should take some responsibility, because Kurds feel humiliated by the Iraqi federal state because they were killed, they were attacked, their land being confiscated. And what they tell me, my friend Baghdad, saying Abadi is trying to solve the problem. Abadi made the problem more complicated and strained the relation between Baghdad and Erbil. It's beyond me that the federal government could not sit with the regional government in order to solve the problem peacefully. They had to use illegal Shia militia groups supported by Iran to attack part of Iraq. Let us not forget, Kurdistan is not a foreign country. Kurdistan is Iraq, okay? I think my friend Baghdad must realize that very, very well. Kurdistan is Iraq.
Rabwa.
And if Mr. Abadi, as a prime minister, cannot solve the problems in his own land, so he's a failure. He's totally failed.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time on this, but Namo Abdullah, Ahmed Rushdie in Baghdad, and Rabwa Fatah in London, we thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
My pleasure.